Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast where we dig into history, religion, and all of those things. I'm your host, Ashley Monsiváis Hernandez, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some common misconceptions that have persisted for centuries and have impacted how we think about Christianity. Now, for many of you guys, when you think of Christianity, what do you think of? I feel like you're probably envisioning grand cathedrals, these beautiful churches in Europe, stained glass windows, or perhaps a certain image of Jesus, one where he has long brown hair, European features, or you may see this depiction of Jesus in Renaissance artworks. All these things have kind of shaped how we view Christianity and understand Christianity in the Western world or the past hundreds of years. But what if I told you that all of this is not even the full story, not even part of the picture? And what if Christianity is not just a Western religion, but one that has ancient, deep roots in the Middle East and Africa? Well, in today's episode, we're going to take a journey into the rich history of Christianity's origins, the history about it, colonialism, misrepresentation, and Eurocentrism, and the role that this has in shaping the Western view of Christianity. And we'll also explore the true birthplace of Christianity, the way that this has been distorted to serve imperialistic purposes, and also how we've been seeing contemporary movements reclaiming this and reclaiming Christianity and its diverse and rich heritage. But before I get into it, I just want to preface that this episode is not trying to diminish the value of any specific history, culture, or faith tradition, but it's kind of meant to serve the purpose of expanding the knowledge that we already have on Christianity and its origins and its complexities and diversity, um, and expand to topics that are not really covered about when we learn about Christianity in the West. So let's begin. To fully understand, we need to go back 2,000 years to the beginning of Christianity, and that begins in the ancient world. Um, the region that Jesus Christ was born is often overlooked in Western narratives. Jesus is the central figure of Christianity, and he was not European. He was a Jewish man located in present day Israel and Palestine, and his teachings emerge from social, political, and religious realities of the Middle East. So he kind of reflected his environment as we all do, and the environment was the Middle East, not Europe. So just want to preface that. Um, and his identity actually plays a major role. Often his nationality and ethnicity is overlooked, but it plays a major role into him as a figure. Because as we have explored kind of your culture and every like it can shape your identity or it cannot. We've seen examples of both, and it's important to acknowledge it. So Jesus' identity as a Middle Eastern Jew, um, we can see that it's minimized a lot to kind of favor the more westernized depiction of him as a white and European figure. But understanding his true heritage kind of challenges that traditional understanding of Christianity that we have. And his teachings were also shaped by Jewish traditions and the social and the political context of the Roman Empire. His message for love and inclusion were seen as radical. He preached a lot about inclusion of the Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles are those who don't associate as being Jewish, who are not Jewish. And he talked about including and being together and being one and loving each other. And this was seen as such a radical view at the time for Jewish people, but it established that belief of marginalizing communities across the empire. Now, after Jesus' crucifixion, his disciples spread across all over the Roman world, but not just Roman empires, just everywhere, and began to spread Christianity. We can see this in Africa, in the Middle East regions, which are crucial regions in the development of the Christian faith. From the beginning, Christianity has had many ethnicities and many cultures in its faith. In the first and second century, we see Christian communities in the Middle East and North Africa emerge, such as Alexandria and Egypt, emerged as very important centers for early Christian thought and theology. And by the second century, we see the emergence of Christian theologians who were starting to develop the Christian doctrine. Or places like Alexandria and the famous Library of Alexandria also served as a focal point for Christian scholarship, and was a very important place for finding and learning about the teachings of Christianity. So we can see how big the influence and spread of Christianity has become now. And a region that this has occurred in is Ethiopia, one of the first Christian nations. It holds such a significant role in early Christianity history. Um, in the 4th century CE, the kingdom of Kusum, which is now located in Ethiopia, had its ruler officially embrace Christianity as its state religion over 100 years before many European nations. And according to people such as Andrew F. Walls, who wrote The Missionaries' Movement in Christianity History, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church developed its own distinct way, different from other churches, independent of European Christian tradition, and it remains a unique expression of Christianity till this day. The European church is nothing like the Ethiopian church. The Ethiopian church has certain traditions and certain ancient manuscripts and certain ancient religious practices that show its roots in Africa. Now, further west, North Africa has very influential Christian theologians, and perhaps a very famous one is Augustine of Hippo, born in what is now Algeria. Augustine's works, such as the Confessions and the City of God, have been such monumental things in shaping Christian theology in both the Eastern and Western Church. And yet, as Diana L. Hayes points out in And Still I Rise, an Introduction to Black Liberation, often his African identity is overlooked. He is kind of grouped along with the European intellectual history, despite his North African roots. Hayes also emphasizes that we should view Augustine's legacy through an lens of African heritage, which offers a counter narrative to the lens that we view him now. Now, the impact of African and Middle Eastern scholars on Christian theology was monumental, and yet, as we look through the lens of Western history, these contributions are often ignored or dismayed, when in truth, Christianity's development is deeply intertwined with Africa and the Middle East, even in its earliest days. Actually, in its earliest days, before it was even in many European nations, as we saw by the examples provided. But the historical contributions of Africa and the Middle East to Christianity were not just intellectual, but they were spiritual and theological. Early Christianity was not just a Western religion, but instead a faith born and nurtured in regions of Africa and the Middle East. And throughout, even though, they started there, we've kind of seen how they've spread and shaped in different parts. Now, with all this, it's kind of difficult to understand why we see Christianity as Western, though, if it has roots in so many different other places. But we must examine the relationship between Christianity and European colonialism. Beginning in the 15th century, as we all know, European nations began exploring and conquering large parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, the Americas, etc. Um, Along with them often came Christian missionaries. However, um, Christianity was not only being spread for religious purposes, but also being used as a tool for imperial domination. And an example of this would be the doctrine of discovery, which is a foundational element in early colonial projects. This was a legal doctrine formed by the Catholic Church, and it declared European Christian nations had the right to claim any land that was not inhabited by Christians. Essentially, any land that was not ruled by Christians was considered empty and thus available for European colonization. Now, this was an instrument for justifying colonization in Africa, in the Americas, and parts of Asia. Um, and it kind of established that idea that Christianity could be used to quote unquote civilize non-Christian people. Um, Philip Jenkins talks about this in his book, The Lost History of Christianity, and he describes how Christian missionaries often accompany these colonial settlers, as I talked about. And although some missionaries did have the true intent of genuinely spreading the gospel and offering humanitarian aid, there were many who kind of aligned with this colonial project and used Christianity to support that European cultural norm and used it to suppress indigenous spiritual traditions. Now, Jenkins argues that missionaries sometimes undermined native beliefs and pushed Western Christianity in ways that disconnected it from its original roots in Africa and the Middle East. So let's look at the central figure of Christianity again, Jesus. A particularly damaging thing about the westernization of Christianity is the image of Jesus. I talked about this in the beginning, but while the historical Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew, European artists began to portray him as white and European, an image that has persisted for centuries. And yes, you can say that this portrayal of him may just be a reflection of the Renaissance art that was popular at the time, but it also was not completely accidental. And artists like Leonardo da Vinci depicted Jesus and other biblical figures as European. And although it was a pattern to portray figures in a certain way because it Renaissance artists, it was just their style. Um, it can't solely be about aesthetics, and it was not solely about aesthetics. But it also has some undertones of aligning Christianity with European identity and reinforcing the idea that salvation was inherently tied to European civilization. And this can have such a subliminal impact on, African and Middle Eastern communities because they're seeing how this religion took such a early root in its place, and now it's being used. It's being claimed as a European identity. It's being used to oppress and colonize. Now, theologians like James Cone and his work in Black theology and Black power explore the consequences of this, um, and the consequences of creating a Jesus who looked like European elite. He talks about how it kind of teaches that Christianity, and by extension salvation, is a privilege only for white people, and for African and indigenous people this portrayal of Christianity kind of reinforced subjugation and alienated them from their own Christian heritage, even though, as we saw by the examples, a lot of them had Christianity prior to Europe. Now, we're going to dive into the role of the church in this. Now, in regions like South Africa, Christianity was deeply intertwined with systems of oppression. An example of this would be the Dutch Reformed Church, which was a Protestant denomination, and it played a significant role in supporting the politics of racial segregation and white supremacy. Um, People within this church would often justify racial discrimination by twisting biblical teachings to support the discrimination of Black South Africans. In the Americas, moving somewhere else, Christianity was used to justify the enslavement of African people. Slave traders and colonial settlers often forced enslaved Africans to adopt Christianity. Um, all of this while denying them their own ancestral practices. And as church leaders preach things like submission and to authority to the African American slaves, they often use Christian theology to justify this, kind of creating the undertone of using Christianity to justify slavery. And this kind of results in a distorted form of Christianity that becomes synchronized with oppression and kind of leaves a legacy that is very harmful towards a lot of non-European groups, especially in the Americas. Now, the colonialization of Africa and the Americas profoundly altered Christianity's course. While European powers were spreading Christianity, they were also reshaping it into something that was more closely tied with imperial control and creating racial hierarchies. However, we'll see that regardless and in spite of all of this did not end Christianity's deep connection with other regions such as the Middle East or with Africa. Now, despite the oppression and misrepresentation and kind of alignment with Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asians they're still Christian to this day. And not only that, there are many groups that have worked to reclaim Christianity as their own. In the 20th century, we see the rise of African initiated churches, um, which have marked a major turning point in faith's history. And these churches have broken away from European controlled denominations and created their own local expressions of Christianity that reflect the cultural realities of their lives. Now, one of these examples would be the reclaiming of the Zion Christian Church in South Africa, founded in the early 20th century. The church is one of the largest Christian denominations in Africa with over 15 million members. The Zion Christian Church incorporates African music, drumming, and dance into its worship services, rejecting kind of the more formal way of Western Christianity. And it blends African cultural practices with Christian teachings. This church serves as a powerful symbol of how Christianity can be reshaped to reflect local cultures. And along with that, we have the rise an establishment of Black liberation theology. In the United States, Black liberation theology emerged as a response to the oppression faced by African Americans. We see theologians like James Cone often referred to as the founders of this, and people like him argue that Christianity should not be a tool for oppression, but a force for liberation. Um, he and James Cone, I know he kind of wanted to redefine Christianity as a faith of resistance. And for Cone's, figures like Jesus represented the oppressed and not the oppressor. And Cone created a theological framework that created a lot of empowerment, um, and gave a lot of motivation to fight for civil rights and to fight for social justice. And we also see people like Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Christian preacher who used Christianity to support his fight for civil rights, encouraging that Jesus would want all of us to love each other the same regardless of racial group. Um, and in today's Christianity, we see how it's still undergoing transformation. As Philip Jenkins describes in the New Next Christian Kingdom, the majority of Christians now live in the global south, um, in places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And these regions are not only the demographic centers of Christianity, but they also represent the future of where Christianity is going to be. We see the rise of the Pentecostal church and very charismatic Christianity, as we've kind of explored, um, which offers very dynamic and community-based forms of Christianity, um, and have a lot of influence of local traditions and local cultures into their everyday practices. Now, this is not just about numbers, but also the emphasis on how Christianity is practiced. Um, Christianity in the global south is often characterized by a powerful personal faith, and this kind of stands in stark contrast to the more institutional and more like formal ways that we have Christianity in the West, that have kind of been the dominant power up until now, where we're kind of seeing more of a shift. And as we kind of conclude, we need to reflect on the early days of Christianity and Middle East and Africa, and its distortion by colonial powers, and now to its modern day reclamation. We kind of see how Christianity is not just a faith from one place or a certain religion from a certain place, but more of a dynamic and global thing. And I feel like this is really important to know about, because often we'll hear blatant statements like Christianity is a white man's religion, or that Christianity comes from Europe. And blatant statements like these can be very harmful, um, and kind of just undermine the true history of it. And of course, while it can be, as we learn about it, it makes it easier to understand why this is so commonly thought out, um, just because of how hard Europe has tried to take Christianity as their own and twist Christianity to fit more and make it seem exclusively European. So it can be easy to understand why people may think this, but it can just be very invalidating to groups that have had Christianity long before Christianity was even here in Europe. Um, so, Christianity's true origins lie not in the West, but they lie in the heart of the Middle East and Africa. And its story continues to be written by millions of believers across the world. So we've seen how Christianity has kind of been co-opted by colonial forces, and we kind of see how it's become a tool of oppression. And we've also seen how marginalized communities have reclaimed their faith as their own, transforming it into a source of liberation and empowerment. And it's crazy to think about because Christianity, like I said, is still unfolding. And it is a faith that is constantly being reshaped by those who follow it, which in turn makes it kind of ignorant to associate Christianity with just one thing. Because if we look at different cultures and if we look around the world, because as we know, Christianity is global, you go to any two places in the world and the Christianity will not be, the church experience will not be the same. A church in Latin America will be nothing like a Southern Baptist church. And yet we have such a specific image of Christianity when it comes to our head. We often like picture like these very structural buildings and um, very structured practices and rituals, when in reality, when you see Christianity in other parts of the world, it differs and it's different. They have the inclusion of their culture into Christianity. Um, so we need to examine that and acknowledge that. And with that, along being said, we kind of see the new forms of Christianity emerge, with different cultures emerging together and creating a new subversion, including their own personal cultures. So that is all I have to share with you guys today. I just want to thank you guys for joining me on this journey through Europe and not through Europe, through history. And I hope that this episode has challenged you guys to think critically more about the history of Christianity and its future. And next time you hear something like, oh, Christianity is a white man's religion, or that Christianity is only for Europeans, or, only people are only Christian because of colonialism, because a white man forced them to, or all of that. We need to acknowledge that it can be easy to understand why people may think of this, but like as we have studied with religions, we know saying all or using blanket statements like that is never the case. There's always something deeper about it, and we could probably go even deeper and find more information, but we could be here for days. So this is kind of just exploring more into what we traditionally think and kind of challenging those normal beliefs and kind of bringing light to contrasting beliefs, like how we talked about the same Christian teachings that was used to justify slavery is now being used to justify civil rights. So it's kind of crazy how we have two sides of the spectrum stemming from the same religion, which kind of can make it hard to classify religion and its beliefs and what it stands for, but it makes it very interesting to learn about, which is why I was very excited to talk about this topic, and just seeing how Christianity is so different everywhere. So I just want to thank you guys for joining me about learning about this, and I hope that this episode has challenged you to think critically about the history of Christianity, and also to wonder what the future will look like. Remember to continue learning about the past so we can understand the future, and see how it's going to be shaped. And until next time, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Bye. Hi, everyone. Again, thank you so much for tuning into this podcast episode. I just wanted to take a quick second to acknowledge the sources that were used to develop the research for this thesis. As we all know, I did my thesis on exploring the belief that Christianity is a white man's religion and kind of how it's been used to depict it as exclusively European, and dive into the history of that and why that is, and also why that's not completely true. So I use a lot of sources for this. The Smith and Ramsey Religions of the World textbook, specifically the sections on African religions and also the section on Christianity. Other sources that were used were Andrew F. Walls' The Missionary Movement in Christian History, Philip Jenkins' The Lost History of Christianity, Dana L. Hayes and Still We Rise, An Introduction to Black Liberation Theology, James Cone, Black Theology and Black Power Movement, and Robert Elm Price, Liberation and Theology in African Contexts. So I just wanted to state those sources, and thank you guys again so much for listening to the podcast.